This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome, everyone. I'm picking up a little flash. Hopefully there'll be insight that goes with it. Oh, it's this light. Okay. I wanted to share with you some of the work that we've been doing here at Cornell, focusing on reducing tillage. It's a collaboration that goes across several universities and sort of regions, as we have a partner in Michigan, where you have some faculty there, Dan Brainerd and Sophia Zendry, who are on our project. And so some of the experiments that we're doing here in New York are repeated there, as well as Mark Hutton, who's here, another collaborator up in Maine, along with Eric Gallant. And so this work, what I want to share with you is focused in on trying to integrate cover crops into strip-tilled systems, and so a reduced tillage system in our organic vegetables. So we've been working with organic vegetables in trying to adapt reduced tillage systems to them for many years, and started our work primarily in conventionally managed vegetables, and a lot of that was funded with SARE, but now we're trying to sort of see how can we adapt and integrate these systems for organic vegetables. And without the tools that our conventional growers have with herbicides, one of our most important concerns and considerations is how do we design these with cover crops so we can actually be managing weeds well in the system. So when I talk about reducing tillage, we're focusing on, and we use reduced tillage, we're not doing a straight no-till here. We're looking at trying to decrease the intensity, the frequency and depth of tillage or soil disturbance over time. So there's some systems that people work on that are looking at rotational tillage, where you're applying tillage at certain parts of your rotation. In our case, we primarily are focusing on strip tillage. We use an Unverfirth type, a deep zone tiller. And this is a tool that creates a narrow and a restricted area of soil disturbance. You have on this, if you've not seen one of these before, the implement itself has a cutting coulter to cut through residue, and then a shank that you set to operate below a compacted layer of soil. And so the goal is to fracture the compacted soil. And then you have a couple of discs here that actually help break up and create a nice little mound of soil that would be right in the area where you're planting. So you're trying to create all of your tillage and soil disturbance in a narrow band of soil that is prepared for planting, direct seeding, or transplanting. And so we opted for this in our area, which is more of the northern tier, because we wanted to make sure with vegetables that we could protect the early season establishment. So having soils warm quickly and having the crop get to a good start, so we're not seeing a delay in the actual crop. A lot of vegetable crops aren't always as vigorous and hardy as some of the field crops, and so trying to optimize those conditions early on. So, and the other thing about the strip tillage is that because it is this sort of compromise where it's not a straight no-till, we do have some different advantages to the system. We're restricting the tillage to that in-row area, and so soils are warming there more quickly. We can get increased mineralization rates because we do have disturbance there, and so we're adding air, oxygen, and disturbing the soil. There's a better seed bed for, like I said, for seeding into. In some cases, we can incorporate fertilizers if they're actually in that area. And in some of our work with conventional growers, we're able to actually apply fertilizer behind the shank deep into the soil so it's available to the crop. And you're dealing with compaction in that area. It also allows us to sort of keep this undisturbed area between there, where if we have a cover crop, we can retain a mulch on the surface of the soil, which can help us actually conserve some soil moisture and ideally protect from erosion, protect from water movement across the field very quickly, as well as creating this habitat for beneficials or pests. We've seen some of both, and generally contributing to soil health. So that's some of the advantages, but it does have its disadvantages as well, because certainly when we're trying to manage that residue and we're restricting the width of our tillage, we can still deal with problems with residue accumulating in that area, making it difficult to create the kind of seed bed we want. And so this is one of our big challenges with cover crop integration into a strip till, is cover crops can still end up either being pinned, or the root balls of themselves will create interference despite the activity of that tool. And so as a result, you can have some problems with stand, poor seed soil contact, because you still don't have an optimized soil condition for getting a good germination of some of our more tender crops. And then they can be maybe 12 inches wide. That's tricky to cultivate in, and so we've been trying different tools, but how do you actually cultivate or manage using equipment-based approaches in that narrow zone? And then between the row, dealing with the residue, particularly if we have a really wet year and you have that mulch in place, you still have to cultivate through it. So what are the tools that you have in hand in order to pull that off? And then in some cases, because we're not actually disturbing the soils there, and an organic system that would also contribute to not having as much nitrogen that's actually being mineralized for the whole system, for the roots, the crop to have available to it. So there are some challenges with it, and those are what we've been trying to explore, and especially with organic systems. We want to be able to reduce tillage as part of that sort of overall soil health approach. And in order to really advance it, we can do this on a bare ground. We can do zone building with bare soil, and yes, we can create conditions fairly easy, but as soon as we add cover crops, we add complications. But we know that when you stack these approaches, we have a more improved benefit to soil health. So that's what our goal is, to sort of figure out how do we integrate these for organic. So some of the basics around managing cover crops for reduced tillage that are sort of true in managing cover crops in general, that we're trying to seed at the appropriate time to have a good biomass that's going to provide some of the benefits of cover crops. And traditionally, a lot of seasoned people who use zone till say kill early, kill effectively to try to manage the residue. But in our case with organic, we're trying to figure out how we have to wait for that killing step in order to actually terminate the cover. So how do we deal with that? In our case, we have chosen to do our work with flail mowing. We're not rolling in these systems. And so that's a distinction I wanted to make for sure, is that in a rolled system where you have much more cover and you're creating that solid mat, that tool wouldn't work. So you're in a no-till system. And in our case, in the more upper part of the Northeast, our soils are much cooler under that system, and other experiments in the past haven't worked as well. You can do it with later planted crops like squashes, and sometimes with larger seeded crops like sweet corn, but you have to delay your planting to make it work. And so we chose to work with the strip till system, so that it's a compromise between full width tillage and then no-till. And so one of the challenges, again, is sort of to be able to have that soil prepared and the conditions correct for actually being able to plant into it and then manage the crop to optimize that yield. So in our experiments, we set this up to look at, in the past, we've looked at both winter-killed cover crops using like oat-pea combinations. And the nice thing about using those in a reduced till system is that they're out of the way. You don't have to deal with them in the following year. The residues don't interfere. But trying to really optimize these systems for the winter hardy type covers, the rye, like a cereal rye and a vetch, this is where we have to think carefully about our planning and our management. So the way we set about to look at alternate management systems for cover crops in this particular trial where we're integrating cover crops with strip till is think about the ways that we're terminating the cover. And so we had three treatments that we used for termination. We used a traditional sort of flail and drop the mulch, leave the cover crop in place. And so we're calling that a mulch treatment because it's basically setting on the surface of the soil. It's left in place. Another system is what we call a cut and carry, in which the covers are flail chopped and then removed with a wagon. So they're flail chopped into a wagon and the residue is completely removed from the field. So the roots are still intact, but the above ground biomass is gone. So it doesn't interfere then with practices that happen later in the season. And then the third is sort of the control, where we would mow the cover crop but then incorporate it with rototilling. So then again, the residue is out of the way, but it's incorporated into the surface of the soil. So hopefully not interfering with any of the other practices. And we looked at it with basically three kinds of cover crop mixes. In this case, it was we used a winter rye and hairy vetch. We also used a winter rye and a crimson clover, and then a straight hairy vetch planting. And so for each of those mixes, we use these different combinations of termination strategy prior to then going in and doing strip tillage. So this is the way that we're trying to see how we can bring them together. In these experiments, we also had a side dress nitrogen application because in our previous work in organic reduced till, nitrogen does appear limiting. And so we wanted to see how and if the supplementary side dress event would actually address a limitation that wasn't at all due to the tillage system specifically. So those are that working with a uniformly seeded type of a mix where you're mixing the rye and the vetch, for example, and putting it across the field as a mix, whether it's drilled, you have a mix is one strategy. But we also wanted to look at what would happen if you segregated your cover crops into strips. And so planting, putting your legume cover crop in the row where you intend to plant and keep the cereal rye or the grain cover in between the rows so you maintain a residue there. So trying to optimize the spatial distribution of the cover crop and also then facilitate possibly the use of the strip tiller in order to create the kind of zones that we wanted for planting. So in this case, it's generally here you have this mix, and when you have this legume, a legume and your cereal mixed together, your nitrogen is also distributed from the legume across the field. But by creating and segregating it where we're putting all of the legume right in the zone where we would strip till and plant the crop, we try to concentrate the nitrogen that's fixed by that legume into the area where the crop will be grown. So we just felt that not only do we get the benefit in this system of actually concentrating the nitrogen, generally those legumes are easier to manage and the residue wouldn't be as problematic in a strip till system. So there was two benefits that could be explored with this. So in order to look at the strip planted, we used the same cover crops. We had winter rye between the row and hairy vetch in the row, a crimson clover in the row, or none. And so we maintained the cereal, the winter rye in between. And again, in all of these cases, basically they were planted in the fall and then flail mode and dropped in place, and then the zone builder was used across the field. And in this case, the zones were built right over where the legume was. And so we created that sort of plan tracking when we seeded these. So again, and there's the mixes. For all of these mixes, we had these three kinds of termination, but then in the case of the strip planted, we just flailed and then we zone built and then looked at how a cabbage crop would perform. So in all of these, we used the cabbage crop. Just an overview of the basic timeline was drilling the cover crops in September, and then in the spring, mowing the cover crop, and then a couple of weeks later, zone building and planting. So the cover crops had some time to actually dry down before we did the zone building and the planting. So these are just a few pictures of the mulch system. So this is the mix of the rye and the hairy vetch. This is typical of what you typically see when you're actually planting these in the field. The rate on the rye was 60 pounds per acre, and then the vetch was at a 20 pound per acre rate. And then this is what it looked like for strip planting with nothing. This is just the rye between the rows and then nothing planted in the row. And so where we would zone build is right in this area here. So the zone, once this has been flailed, the zone builder would be run right through this area. And then here's a neat picture where we have the hairy vetch that's planted in the area that we would be zone building, and then the crimson clover to give you an idea of how it looked like prior to termination. And so first thing I wanted to share is the overall biomass of the cover crops, just to give you a sense of how these grew. And this experiment and its design was replicated also in Michigan with Dan Brainerd. And so he was doing his experiment on a sandy loam soil, and this is information from 2016, a dry year. And they were really challenged there because of irrigation and the lack of moisture. And so you can see that their biomass was much lower in their experiment. But when you look across what we had at our trial that was in here in the Ithaca area in Freeville at our organic research farm, the cereal rye was the bulk of the biomass. And in fact, where we had just the vetch crop, fairly low biomass, again, this was just vetch. They had an oat nurse crop that went out with it, but it was just primarily vetch in the system. And whether it was strip planted or if the vetch and the rye were mixed and brought sort of planted uniformly across the field, about the same amount of biomass was generated. So there wasn't a big difference in the amount of biomass within a combination of cover crops. When we looked at the amount of total nitrogen that was in the above ground biomass, this is again to give you a sense of the contribution of the legume as well as the rye to the subsequent crop, because it did play out in the performance of the crops afterwards. So having the straight vetch had the highest total amount of N in the above ground biomass. So despite having a fairly low total dry biomass above ground, it still had more nitrogen that was contributed to the system. And that is an important point that'll be carried out later on with the results. In the strip planted as well as the mixed crops, we had about half as much of the nitrogen that was contributed by the legumes, and also some that was in the rye itself. But this just gives you a sense of the total amount of nitrogen that was in this above ground biomass of the cover crops. That doesn't say anything about what was happening below ground, but just as an estimate of above ground. And so again, once we flail milled everything we went through and we zone built, one of the challenges in trying to do zone building, especially with something like rye, is the heavy amount of residue. And so having the right, doing some work with make sure you have row cleaners in front of your implements is really important, especially in front of the planter. And it could be challenging. This was a picture from Michigan where they had it integrated into their strip till unit where they could do everything in one pass. We had to sometimes use a separate pass in the first year, but having that row cleaner in front really was important. Even though we might have strip planted it, we still had to move the residue out of the way. It's when you flail, it still gets in the way, and it can still create it can impact how well that strip tiller works. But this is just a picture of how it looks afterwards. You have these bands that are disturbed and ready for planting after we've actually gone through with the zone builder. And so depending on the mix of the cover crop, the residue lasted different amounts of time over the season. And so we definitely, in the case of the rye vetch, sort of at the beginning of this season, you could see a lot of that rye vetch present, and it lasted quite a bit later. This was in a dry year, so it did actually have some residual effect. And in the past, we found about 3 weeks is the best we get as far as weed suppression from a cover that's in the row after it's been mowed. So that's about it. But even in the vetch, it did actually have some residual vetch, but not very much. And so this is important when it comes to doing weed management passes. And so this year, Brian Caldwell, who's here, he does all of our equipment work, which we're really grateful for. We have had a hillside rolling cultivator at the farm, and we use it in this strip till system, and it did a really good job of being able to deal with between row weeds. And so you can see here in the zone, you can see where the zone is, where this cabbage is, but then in between that rolling cultivator actually moved through and then managed to actually do a really nice job of cleaning up in between the rows in spite of the remaining residue that was there. And that is in trying to put together the system, it's important to you have to sort of think through these pieces of it, because it's not just about adapting one part of the system in order to make it work. So having the right row cleaners on planters as well as on the zone tiller, having planned ahead for the weed management strategy, because dealing with residue makes everything more complicated. So this is just a picture of the hillside that has these gangs of, these have discs on them. And you can adjust it with hydraulics, fairly small scale. We do everything on 2 rows. I see all these pictures from agronomic crops that are much wider, but we stay very humble within our little 2-row system. So I just wanted to share here a little bit about the nitrogen. So I told you earlier that in the case of the vetch, a fairly high amount of nitrogen was in the above ground biomass. And when we rototilled that, so these are the 3 tillage systems, the rototill being the first bar, then the cut and carry where we actually flail chopped and removed it. And then versus the mulch system was actually the traditional flail, drop it, and then strip till it. So that residue is on the surface. That when, in the case of just post-planting, looking at soil nitrogen levels, that when we had rototilled the vetch in, there was definitely a burst of nitrogen that was mineralized and made available to the crop right at planting. And that even carried through at the time of side dress, which is a few weeks later. So we still had the impact of that practice and that management strategy with the hairy vetch, only in there. And the other cover crops, fairly low levels of soluble nitrogen measured in the soils in the planting zone. But when, and we looked at the cabbage biomass, and the response in the cabbage sort of reflected that same amount of nitrogen that was available, where in the case of the vetch with the high end contribution, we saw again rototilled a higher amount, a larger plant, a higher growth rate, but that didn't actually carry through all the way to harvest. When it came to harvest and then we came to our yields, they all caught up at the end as far as with the hairy vetch. So this is 2 years of data from this experiment, 2016 and 2017, hot off the press. Here's the first year and the second year, and the first thing I would just suggest is that the patterns are really similar over both years, what we observed with these cover crop combinations and these management strategies. Again, the first bar would represent the management rototill versus the cut and carry and the mulch system, where we're just dropping it and leaving it like a mulch on the surface. And this is the, and then in this case, we had the 3 different cover crops that we compared: the mixed rye and hairy vetch, mixed rye and crimson clover, and just straight vetch. So when no nitrogen is applied, basically these were not side dressed. So this was the part of the experiment we didn't do any side dressing. The vetch definitely stood out as supporting the best yield compared to the rye vetch mix and the rye crimson clover. So if you look at, in the case of just the vetch, the management system for that cover didn't matter. We had similar yields, whether we rototilled it in, removed the above ground biomass, or we left it on the surface of the mulch. And so this is like the really traditional strip till. And so it's in whether it was the vetch, the rye and crimson clover, here again, no significant difference between a traditional rototilled approach to dealing with that cover or a strip till. So this is good news. Yes. And then, and it was same in both years. And if we compare the cover crop combination for rototilled, basically the vetch was performing better than the combinations. The rye crimson clover was definitely poor performing in these systems. And one of our challenges with that is sort of an artifact of the experimental design, and that we had to flail and mow everything on the same day. If we had optimized the time of kill, we probably would have had better performance than that. And then when we looked at the strip planted versus the mixed covers, in this case, again, here we have the vetch, which is just a straight vetch planted across the field, but it's included as a nice comparison for a high nitrogen cover. And then in the other extreme, we have a rye with no legume. So you can see here that the light blue bars are with no nitrogen applied as an additional side dress, and then with a side dress nitrogen applied across all of the cover crop mixes. And so what becomes really apparent is whether we strip planted or mixed planted the cover crops, that the responses were pretty much similar. So the use of that strip planted cover, while it might have provided some benefits to us as far as being able to do the zone building and actually implement the strategy, didn't result in much of a difference in the yield compared to if we were just mixing covers in a traditional way. This is kind of a bummer because we were really thinking we were on the track, but that's what we have learned here. I think the other thing to note is that we've always been concerned with organic when we're restricting the width of tillage through something like this, that we're not going to get all that nitrogen mineralized through the disturbance of soil that would be really important for many of our vegetable crops. And when we did side dress, we generally got a slight improvement we got an improvement in the yield, but it wasn't always significantly different. So for all of these mixes and for vetch, adding the supplemental side dress didn't really improve the performance. But for those particular treatments where we're really seeing low nitrogen, yes, we did see an improvement in the yields in those cases. So again, this is year 1 and year 2, very similar results. In Michigan, where they had much drier conditions, a similar pattern. They didn't have the vetch treatment like we did, but again, seeing the same. In their case, because they had such poor growth in their cover crops, they didn't have a lot of nitrogen fix. It was very dry. That it's really where they had nitrogen added that they were actually able to support yields and get enough yields from the cover. And so the interaction of nitrogen supplementation, depending on conditions, becomes really important to make these systems work. So just in summary for where we're at with this work. So again, this is part of a 4-year project, and this was 2 years focused on strip till and cover crops. That our cabbage in a reduced till system, in the strip till, did as well as if we had rototilled. So we didn't see we had similar yields in the strip tilled and the rototilled. Sometimes with the cut and carry system, when we were removing all that above ground biomass, we did see a slight depression in the performance of the cabbage and the yield loss, which makes some sense if that's actually contributing to the nitrogen for the crop. And then I didn't show all of the combinations where we added nitrogen, but generally it improved the performance of the crop. And then I think certainly in some years with more rainfall where there could be other stresses, it's a logical thing to be including a side dress application, but we didn't always see a yield benefit. The vetch only cover crop really did optimize the cabbage performance, which is interesting because it's actually it doesn't create as much residue that you have to manage. But we haven't looked at other sort of benefits to soil health, and we didn't look at carbon or any of the other indicators that might suggest that, to balance what are the outcomes of using this cover crop combination with reduced till. And so the strip till planted covers helped, but they didn't actually, it wasn't that much different. While we thought it would help us really make the system work, it wasn't that big of an improvement. And it certainly didn't, it facilitated the reduced tillage, but we didn't see a difference in yield. So that's kind of where we're at with it. And just wanting to highlight again the partnerships and the research that's going on here across these different institutions. So, and I want to call out Ryan Marr, who works in the program, and Brian Caldwell as well. They are really the energy that makes this whole thing roll.
Can we take a few questions?
Yeah.
We have extra time at the very end, so we can fill over a little bit. Any questions?
Yeah.
So, wondering, how long do you think that you flail mowed the cover crop before the date that you would have been able to go with? And they have an estimation of how much time you stayed with.
So if we, I think we flailed at anthesis, so I think it would have probably been rolled at the same time. I think that it's primarily the cold soils, and then the rolling restricts our ability to do any kind of rescue with cultivation later in the season, so that's one issue. And those are the primary ones for why we didn't roll. And we don't have a roller crimper. That's another one. But I have a rolling stock chopper. I mean, I tried this in the past and worked with Steve Groff back in in the 2000s where we would actually roll covers using different, different ways of chopping and rolling and crimping. But in an organic system where it's even more, I think, restricted, and the soil temperature is more important to me at this point. Yeah. Yeah.
How did you plan to cover crops and strips, or how would you recommend growers do it?
I've done it one way, I think, in using a drill and blocking holes. And so, no, I don't. Tell me, how was it?
Yeah, so the cabbage is on 30-inch spacing, and our drain drill has 7.5-inch in the rows, so there's 4 rows, between each row of cabbage or corresponding to each row of cabbage. So it has our drill has a large seed box and a small seed box.
Yeah.
So we could just block 2 rows to the little seed holes for the large seed, and put the large seed through, in between the rows, and then in the small seed we would tape off just the other 2 ones and have the legume seed fall through those. The bench, we did a little hand seeding with a giant seeder, so that's a good point.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Right, so the crimson clover, we could do it with 1 pass, but we did actually made it 2 passes.
There's other like a cedar that I've used in the past that we could actually, depends on where the auger is in it, and so if the auger is below the seed box, then we were able to actually block fully, and we could mix the seed. But when we were doing hairy vetch in a strip and rye in a strip, we had to mix oats with it to slow down the flow. So that's how we created we were able to regulate the rate, so we could get the rate of vetch that we wanted is by using oats.
Maybe one more question before we transition.
Yeah.
Yes, in back. Strip till and possibility shifting, like, are you setting up your strips in the same place as here? I guess that's
Yeah, so it's you're getting at a really good thing, is that, yeah. So in this experiment, we aren't in the same field in both years, but in the past, when I've done experiments looking with zone building in the same field, we go 15 inches. We offset each year. So we'll zone till in one area the first year, then we'll move to the middle the next year. And then experienced growers over time who are able to keep with the system are able to actually bring the shanks up so they're not disturbing as deeply over time. So they're moving from the deep zone till to more of a shallow strip till system. So that is a way in which a field or soils will adapt over time to the system. Yeah.
Tell me one more time.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.